Welcome everyone to the fifth session of the Infrastructure and Nature webinar series. We are working our way through the infrastructure life cycle through 6 sessions over 2 months. So far, we have explored planning, policy, and finance, design for nature-based solutions, and have another excellent discussion today on how to balance ecological connectivity with linear infrastructure. My name is Ryan Bartlett. I'm the Director for Climate Risk Management and Resilience at WWF in the US, and I have the privilege of organizing this series and introducing the session today. So last year, a group of individuals from over 20 organizations, ranging from NGOs to companies to multilateral development banks and research institutions, came together to organize and co-host a week-long pavilion at the IUCN World Conservation Congress. The topic was, how can we deliver the infrastructure we need while restoring biodiversity, building resilience, and creating a just and carbon neutral future. This pavilion was designed to explore how the private sector, civil society, and government can work together to reimagine 2 things. How can we develop the built infrastructure of our future to ensure a healthy planet and thriving communities? And second, how can we both protect and support the essential benefits intact, connected ecosystems provide for people and the planet? That is the topic of today's discussion. How can we build the infrastructure we need while still maintaining the connectivity essential for ecosystems to survive and thrive in a warming planet? In spite of the delays brought about by the pandemic this year, critical deliberations continue on global agreements like the Conventions on Biodiversity and the Paris Climate Accord, along with the World Conservation Congress. All of these are now taking place in 2021. But our group decided to go ahead and start the discussions for the Congress and hold this virtual pavilion, quote unquote, over these 2 months. The discussions to date have been fascinating, and today's session will surely continue that trend. We have an excellent lineup of speakers, so please get your questions ready. And on that note, there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit questions, which we will try to answer throughout the webinar and during the final discussion section. There's also a little button that you can click to upvote particular questions that you like that are coming in. So to lead the way today, our moderator is Kate Newman. Kate is Vice President for Infrastructure and Public Sector Initiatives. She specializes in large-scale conservation planning and policy support with a focus on sustainable infrastructure in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. In her 3 decades with WWF, she has worked with WWF country teams and their partners around the world to create a more harmonious balance between conservation and economic development, and to enhance collaboration between government and civil society. Prior to WWF, Ms. Newman worked for the US Agency for International Development and the Peace Corps in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. She received a BA in anthropology from the University of Virginia and an MSc in environmental management from the University of London. Kate, over to you.
Hey, Ryan, thanks very much. Well, I have to say these are extraordinary times. It's a time of great tragedy for many and certainly for all of us, a lot of uncertainty. But, perhaps equally it's a time of opportunity. It's an opportunity to reflect on where we are now and how we got here, which is extraordinary, but then an opportunity to rethink our future. Over the past months, it's been so interesting to me to hear some of the words that infrastructure investors and developments have been using to describe their outlook for what they'll be looking for in the next era of infrastructure investment. Words like flexible or permeable, repurposable, resilient, mobile, modular, and impermanent. We had to learn quickly this year to adjust our entire way of working and often our entire way of just living in order to survive this pandemic. It's shedding a new light on what's important and essential during a crisis and what we're going to need to change in order to weather the next storm. And we know with climate change, this is not the first crisis we're going to be facing as a globe. But it's funny, to look at these words and how so many of them are in the lexicon of the ecologist. We could really be describing how nature actually works. Ecosystems are constantly on the move, adapting to shocks, ensuring flows from genes and massive migrations to building resilience to change, permeability, almost all of these, and then most of all, impermanence. To survive and thrive and advance, Nature basically goes with the flow.
And
And now we're recognizing more and more during this terrible time that we need to learn how to do the same thing, to shift from a focus on shorter term performance in business to longer term resiliency, from just in time to just in case, and from commuting to work to connecting to work, from air travel anywhere we want to go and anytime. And believe me, I used to travel a lot for this job, but to now accessing our goods and our services and our entertainment locally. This will certainly be driving a need for more communications connectivity and distributed power to reach the poor and the vulnerable and reduce their digital divide, which is separating so many people from global advances, and all that physical infrastructure that's going to make that happen. And it may mean moving out of packed cities to suburbs or smaller towns or back to the village, which may lead to more roads and rail. So as this evolves, nature must continue to flow and adapt too. We cannot get in nature's way. We need nature to be able to function because its resilience is our resilience. So today we're going to explore how we can achieve that harmony and balance and get it right for our own safety and security and benefit and joy and for the sake of the planet. This is the fifth session, as we've heard, of the seminar series on infrastructure and nature. And today the focus is on bringing attention to the urgent actions that are necessary and the existing solutions that are available to balance environmental conservation with the unprecedented rate of current and planned development of linear infrastructure. And by linear, I like to think of going through. It's the action of infrastructure that goes through an environment. It could be canals, it could be rail, it could be power lines, and we're going to hear more about that from our next speaker. But we're especially concerned about how this throughput, which brings services to everyone along the way, but also wreaks some sort of impact all along the way through an environment. So it's a very complex concept, and we're very concerned about how that's going to play out in future in areas of high biodiversity, especially where the fragility of nature is so apparent. This webinar will highlight diverse perspectives on the issues and the threats and the opportunities for applying the practice of connectivity conservation, enabling nature to be able to move and access and flow, and to help all avoid and mitigate the impacts of linear infrastructure on this ecological connectivity and maintain the movement of species and this flow of natural processes that nature relies on, but so do we. We'll also hear about how to align best practices in science and policy and technical solutions that achieve better safeguards for protecting this ecological connectivity and for ensuring that our planet will thrive while boosting human, social, economic well-being. So to get us rolling and to help us with the concepts is Rob Ament. He's a senior conservationist at the Center for Large Landscape Conservation and the co-chair of the Transport Working Group under the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas Connectivity Conservation Specialist Group. Rob, take it away.
Thank you, Kate. First slide, please. Next slide. So I appreciate the opportunity to sort of give the broad principles of road ecology, rail ecology, and the study of other linear infrastructure and its impacts on connectivity. And so next slide, please. So when we're talking about linear infrastructure, we're really talking about roads, rails, power lines, canals, pipelines, and fences. And roads have been well studied for several decades now, while fence ecology is just a rapidly introduced new field of study in the last 3 to 5 years. So you'll probably be hearing more about roads because we know more about the impacts and the solutions. Next slide. And as Kate has pointed out, the reason we need to start addressing the impacts is because they provide so many benefits for the social development. And as we increase more of the infrastructure is being expanded for many of these benefits as listed here. Next. But what we want to look at today are what are these impacts, and specifically linear infrastructure and its impacts on ecological connectivity. Next. So when we talk about direct impacts, many of our speakers are talking about land use change, how the infrastructure creates habitat loss and fragmentation. And then for some modes, road mortality is a big issue. And also the barrier effect, where animals will approach the linear infrastructure and may actually turn back and not cross. Next. And then there are other secondary effects when we think about linear infrastructure, and deforestation, air quality is reduced. There are many edge effects, so forest interior species with these openings created by linear infrastructure are impacted. Often people will settle illegally off of new roads punched into previously intact landscapes. And of course, there's legal and illegal resource extraction once access is provided by this infrastructure. Next. And so as we think about how much expansion is occurring, already today we have the human footprint dominates half of the globe. So we're just seeing additional development in many of those gray areas that haven't been developed yet. Next. And so the current impact of just of roads alone is 33.5 million kilometers. So it is some people call it the largest impact of any particular infrastructure across the globe. And given that we have so many roads already, it's amazing to think that 25 million new kilometers of road lanes. So by road lanes, that means a 2-lane highway may become a 4-lane highway, or a 4-lane highway may become a 6-lane highway. So it's not just new roads, but it's also expanding the current road system. And it's not just roads. So we're seeing our rail systems, again, projections are over 300,000 kilometers of new railways are going to be built in the next 20 to 30 years. So the study of these impacts have been ongoing, and there have been at least 3 books now on the road ecology. Railway ecology, the first book on that subject just came out about 5 years ago. And just a couple of years ago was the very first paper, and there's no book yet, but there have been several journal articles that we need to start looking at the impacts of fences on ecological connectivity and other ecological values. So we do know that people have been looking at these issues and coming up with solutions. Next.
Rob, you have 1 minute left, please.
Thank you. Next. And so we have been, the field has been looking at many different solutions. And of course, we always go through the mitigation hierarchy. And avoidance, of course, is the preferred source or selection you would want to make when putting in new development or new linear infrastructure. But there are other ways. If you do build such structures, there are ways to minimize and mitigate it, which many of our speakers will be talking about these options later in the talks today, as well as compensate. If you can't zero out your impacts, there is potential to improve habitats or in other parts of the landscape. Next. And we have many technical solutions. There have been not only just general textbooks about it, but we're actually coming out with technical types of documents that are guiding the mitigation of the impacts of linear infrastructure. Almost every continent of the globe has some kind of technical guidelines. They might have handbooks. So practitioners are beginning to see many more tools and summaries of the best practices to build and manage and reduce the impacts of linear infrastructure. And lastly, there are also policy solutions. And even the IUCN just this year has come out with one on wildlife-friendly linear infrastructure, as well as another one on ecological connectivity. So both the technical and the policymakers are starting to pay much more attention to addressing linear infrastructure, as our following speakers will be pointing out to you. So thank you, and it's back to you, Kate, with this very brief introduction of the field of linear infrastructure and ecology. Thank you.
It is a fascinating topic. Thanks a lot, Rob. It's very helpful to set the scene. Now we're going to move into part one, which is on the global collaboration for ecological connectivity and sustainable linear infrastructure. And we have two speakers for you today. I'll start with a brief introduction, and recall that the more full introductions are in the chat as we go along. So to keep this brief, I'll just provide the very top line intros to all the speakers. So Wendy Elliott, a dear colleague living in Africa, is the deputy leader of the wildlife practice at World Wildlife Fund International. And Andreas Seiler is the senior researcher at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences and chairperson of the Scientific and Expert Committee of the Infrastructure and Ecology Network Europe, which I call IENI, others say AINE. It's one of my favorite organizations because we get these great talks, and they'll be setting the scene for all of us in January. I hope, Andreas, you'll give a little info on the upcoming conference. So we'll start with Wendy. Wendy, go ahead.
Thanks, Kate, very much. Yeah, and I'm excited to be here. And I think we're really understanding more than ever before how ecological connectivity, which is essentially the ability of wildlife and ecological processes to move and flow across land and seascapes, is so essential for nature's health as well as our own. This connectivity is really the circulatory system of nature, but as we've seen, and you all know, this is severely under threat. But I'm going to share with you a quick snapshot of what we believe to be a growing momentum around ecological connectivity and how this is being mainstreamed across sectors, which I hope can be a bit of an inspiration to guide and inspire further action. Next slide. So I'll talk across various sectors, firstly around policy. And of course, connectivity issues have long been discussed in global policy fora, but this year, despite all its challenges, COVID related, has been actually a particular year of momentum. So in February of this year, the 13th Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Migratory Species passed a resolution that has given us a clear and globally agreed definition of ecological connectivity, which you see there. It's the unimpeded movement of species and the flow of natural processes that sustain life on Earth. And that same meeting adopted a declaration affirming a commitment to maintaining and restoring ecological connectivity being one of the top priorities for this convention, and calling for the post-2020 global biodiversity framework to also prioritize it. Next slide. And it's been extremely positive to see that the early signs from the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework of CBD are indeed incorporating stronger elements and commitments on connectivity than we've seen before. Just highlighting a few aspects here, we have connectivity included in the first goal and in Target 1 and Target 2. And of course, all the necessary governmental negotiations to finalize and adopt this framework are still to take place. We're waiting for COVID for that. But this is really a great start. Next slide. And there's a lot of policy now at national levels, sort of flowing from global to national, that's delivering great results as well. This is one example from Bhutan, where they've created additional protected areas, the ones you see here in dark green, that essentially form a network of entirely connected protected areas. Really an outstanding achievement for a whole country. And we're seeing lots of connectivity legislation emerging in other countries as well, in Asia, and even in the US, various states of the US which have passed wildlife corridor acts. Next slide. And there's a huge amount now in the practice of connectivity conservation that has emerged. We have the brand new IUCN guidelines on connectivity conservation that really provide a fantastic basis for common language and definitions on connectivity, guidance on planning and implementing ecological corridors and networks, and really sort of bring it all together. And at WWF as well, we've undertaken several efforts to really pull together partners and our own network to ideate innovative ways forward on topics around connectivity, some of which are contained in the report you see there. Next slide. But I think the field that particularly excites me, my techie nature, is really the science, how advanced the science around connectivity has become. It's growing so rapidly. We're really now entering a situation where we have the tools and data and approaches that allow for a really sophisticated approach to securing connectivity on the ground. So this is one example of work in the central India landscape, which essentially holds almost around 10% of the global tiger population, so incredibly important, but a lot of connectivity issues in here, a lot of diverse land use types in the landscape. A team have used combined genetic analysis from tigers from different protected areas, and they've looked at that, analyzed that across various landscape variables to create a permeability map that you can see here. So you can really, quite clearly model now those areas that are going to be most important for tiger permeability in the landscape. Next click, great. And we're also, there's much more sophistication now in combining multi-species connectivity models, such as this Brennan et al. Study from this year, which combines modeling with satellite data from various species to create a connectivity map for a very large area in Southern Africa. Next. And talking about science and innovation, this is a really standout project for me. It's a piece of work happening in Myanmar, where WWF and the Smithsonian Institute are developing a workflow for rapidly mapping wildlife corridors in Google Earth Engine. They conducted a week-long mapathon event in Myanmar, which brought together a whole diverse range of stakeholders to map the corridors and develop recommendations for mitigating impacts on linear infrastructure. And the next step is to follow the mapathon with a planathon, where decision makers can incorporate the information into planning in real time with direct input from data experts. So if we get these sort of innovations are really enabling us to more effectively tackle the challenge. And I think this science and innovation emergence will continue to make it easier than ever to provide decision makers what they need. Next slide. But we're also seeing an enormous amount of momentum with the communities that are living in these areas. This is Chain Kumar Chaudhry, who lives in the Kata corridor in Nepal, and is responsible for setting up and maintaining camera traps like the one in the photo to monitor wildlife movement. This community undertook a major process to reforest this corridor and now manage it as a community forest, and use cameras like these to give a glimpse into how wildlife like tigers and rhinos are using that corridor to move through. Next slide. And in the corporate sector, which is particularly relevant to linear infrastructure, of course, there's also very strong momentum from the World Business Council on Sustainable Development's call to action on landscape connectivity. Next slide. through to the science-based targets for nature's interim guidance, which is freshly out, and really many companies are looking to this to guide their target setting and action on biodiversity. This specifically highlights that companies should assess the extent of ecological connectivity in areas they'll be operating and avoid impacts that would sever such connectivity. Next slide. And there's also a lot of individual corporate actions as well, right from major sourcing companies that are requiring all farms that they source from to maintain or create wildlife corridors, right through down to individual plantation owners like Saba Softwood Bernhard here that's reforesting a significantly long corridor throughout its plantation. Next sector, next slide even. And that corporate momentum is being reflected in the financial sector as well, with institutions like FIFC recommending mitigation measures such as biological corridors, and the Inter-American Development Bank stipulating that infrastructure projects should have project design for maximum ecological connectivity. And we'll hear some really impressive work from the Asian Development Bank as well later in this session. Next slide. So essentially, I think this is really an exciting time in which we have real momentum across policy, practice, science, community, corporate and finance sectors to achieve the ecological connected landscapes like these that we really need. And this is never, the need for this has never been more apparent than now. We remain in the midst of a global pandemic, and we're all increasingly aware that the fragmentation of natural habitats and loss of connectivity is a key driver of risk for the emergence of infectious diseases that can have similarly devastating consequences. Getting linear infrastructure right will be an absolutely essential element in achieving landscapes that look like this. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from the next speakers about how this is happening on the ground.
1 minute left, please.
I finished with 1 minute to spare. So move on to the next slide. Okay, so I'll hand over now to Dr. Andreas.
Thank you very much, Wendy. Can you see my video? Now here it is, yes. Good. With the risk of being repetitive, with what Rod already told us about the development, please take the next slide. We are facing a significant increase in the development of transportation and infrastructure in the next decades. This is quite obvious. And this can have severe devastating effects on our environment. We are well aware of that. It may disrupt ecosystem services and processes, deplete natural resources, and probably also lead to increase the change in the climate. So we need to do something about that. But I think, next slide, please. The message is well heard, and people increasingly start to realize that we are sitting in the same boat or sitting on the same globe, so to say. We need to decouple transportation and the development of transportation from its negative environmental impacts. That is quite clear. But we also realize that we're driving the same cars, we are building the same roads, we are producing the same kinds of problems, have the same questions and needs, and eventually come up with pretty much the same solutions. So there's a potential for accomplishing a change if we work together. Next slide, please. Future transportation must be sustainable. This is quite clear. It must be environmentally and ecologically resilient. It must be socially acceptable, affordable, and you name it. More and more countries are realizing that, as we have already heard by Wendy and Rob. The transport sector itself is waking up, maybe a bit slowly though, but the word is heard and spread. Just thinking about the wildlife-friendly infrastructure that the IUCN is claiming now, and projects that are coming up to mainstream ecological concern into infrastructure and transportation planning. Even the World Economic Forum is focusing on that and is highlighting the need to do some change. So I really would like to be optimistic and remain optimistic, and I think the future may still be green if we can do something about it. Next. How do we accomplish that then? Well, we have heard about strategies and policies. This is very well. There are strategies of how to deal with road ecology on a global scale and a national scale, and these are probably very well developed. There are new strategies in the making. There's also tremendous data and knowledge already available that has been compiled into handbooks and guidelines, such as the Handbook of Road Ecology that Rob already presented, or the Hygiene Handbook on Wildlife and Transport that is now in a completely digital and online format, which will be updated regularly by a large group of experts from science and practice all over the world. This Hygiene Handbook, you have the link on the slide, also shall provide some kind of a portal where other guidelines and directives can link into, so that we can network and work together on that. However, these guidelines and the strategies, they're all built on the existing knowledge and the best practices that we have had so far. And I think to push the development further, we need new solutions. We need innovative designs, innovative tools and measures. And all this development will require more of an applied and directed research. Next slide. The problem is, however, that there is still quite a disparity between science and practice. There's a chasm between the needs of researchers and the needs of practitioners. While science can provide with theory, cause-effect relationships, good ideas, the focus within science is still very much on the individual merit of a researcher. So it's the number of publications that counts for the scientist, for the researcher in the academic world. This leads, of course, to the risk that the studies are too theoretical and not really applicable in the real world. Practitioners, on the other hand, they're more known to do trial and error studies. They learn by doing, but they're not educated in statistics or scientific methods. So they risk that their studies will be really poor designed, maybe only providing anecdotal results. To come up with a better product, so to say, better, more evidence-based results, we need to work together. We need to put together science and practice. Next slide. So, and of course, collaboration is going on in different aspects. There are these international studies that are funded by FERL, PIARG, CEDAR, or the International Union for Railways, for example, where we do cross-evaluations, compile best practice examples, make reviews of published data, or even meta-analysis if possible. So, but they're all, again, focused on the data that has been compiled and achieved already. What we are sometimes easily forgetting is that there are studies going on all the time. There are projects that are commissioned by the different agencies, by different companies. And they can be very local, they can be larger scales, but such as the building of new roads, for example, or the building of ecoducts, fauna passages, new fences, you name it. But all these projects are often very poorly followed up. So much of the potential knowledge that we can gain from these studies is lost because they're not coordinated and they're not communicated in a good way, in a sufficient way. Next slide. So we need to develop as I may call it, the project-based collaboration. This is the collaboration between the actors, between road agencies or railway companies, for example. It can be a cross-country approach, but it can also be an approach within a country. It doesn't take a big budget and it doesn't take political incentives, although that is always well to have. money is there because these everyday projects are already committed and already done. The only thing that is needed is a coordinated study design and a partnership between the public and the private sector, between science and practitioners and the agencies who need this kind of information. So we can have separate budgets in the different projects, but we share the resources. An excellent example for that kind of work is the Ecological project in France. You can take the next slide. So what if the agency would collaborate at a more local level as well, not only globally or internationally, but locally? Then communication is key, of course. And it needs some kind of a joint or cross-disciplinary platform to enable this kind of communication. But instead of only learning from each other's mistakes and best experiences, if we work together, we can actually learn together. And this could boost the development of new, more affordable and more sustainable mitigation measures. Next slide. One of these forums, such a forum is the IENA network. IENA has been developing from a very much European perspective into a network that has many participants, many members from all around the world. And we are providing conferences, seminars, workshops, projects, also together with our friends and colleagues in the other networks that have been developing in the other countries, like the ICOET or the ACLIER, the ANET conference. Together, we provide a forum for collaboration that helps us to learn together and develop better mitigation measures and better, to deal with the challenges that we have in front of us. If you're interested, please have a look at the conference, the IENA conference that was actually planned for January this year, but it has been postponed to the coming January. You can find the information on the website iena2020.info. Thank you very much. And I hand it over to Kate.
Great. That was really fascinating and so helpful for understanding how this works and the kinds of successes that are going on. And I was really pleased that you were showing in that last slide all the different communities out there available for any of you to join and follow to learn more about how this all works. So it's such a growing and exciting field. So in this next session, we're going to have regional and national perspectives. Environmental safeguards for linear infrastructure around the world. And we have four speakers. The first is Dr. Tobias Nyumba. He's a research scientist at the African Conservation Center and project coordinator for the Development Corridors Partnership. Karma Yangzang is the principal environmental specialist in the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department at the Asian Development Bank. And Tamara Lotkova and Milan Sotny are engineers and environmental specialists at the National Motorway Company of Slovakia. And Whisper Kamomines is the wildlife biologist for the Wildlife Management Program at the Natural Resources Department of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes in North America. So thank you very much for joining us, all of you, and we look forward to hearing your remarks. So let's get started with Dr. Tobias Nyumba.
Many thanks, Kate, and good evening and good morning, everybody, for joining us. Thank you so much. I'm glad to get this chance to share what we are doing at the Development Corridors Partnership down here in Nairobi in collaboration with our partners. And of course, this is in response to what Rob alluded to at the beginning, the rapid expansion and the construction of new infrastructure that is targeted to double or even quadruple by the year 2050. The most important bit of it that I would want to add is that it will surprise you that close to 90% of this new infrastructure is actually targeting the developing world that is also very rich in biodiversity, but very fragile in terms of the quality of the ecosystem. Next slide. So in response to this, the Development Corridors Partnership came together, which is a collaboration of institutions from the UK, China, and Africa, particularly, to try and generate evidence around the impacts of infrastructure and other development corridors in the continent in order to help guide policy and support the development of better solutions for the mitigation of their impacts. Next. Now, one such impact, continue. One such impact is what the transportation corridors have on the ecological systems, particularly wildlife in terms of their movement, in terms of their access to resources, but also in terms of adaptation to climate change. And therefore, across the globe, you must have come across several of these images that I've displayed here, animals killed across different landscapes. But the most important is where such infrastructure traverses key ecosystems, where wildlife are decimated and their habitats are broken into pieces or fragmented with a lot of disregard. And we've seen, as we'll see in some of the work that we've done, this has now risen to a point where a lot of interest is being raised and people are starting to really realize that these impacts need to be addressed. Next. Continue. Good. So at the global level, the awareness about the impacts of particularly linear infrastructure on biodiversity is not something new. And so in the developed countries such as US and in Europe, this work has been going on for so many years, as Rob mentioned, from the early 1960s. And of course, it's been ongoing, but the challenge is the impacts have never really been diminished. So we still have cases of birds and other mammals, both large and small mammals being decimated at length, with numbers exceeding 400 million vertebrates that have been killed across different landscapes. Next. And the most depressing bit is that as much as 90% of this infrastructure is targeting developing countries, there is really not much going on in terms of trying to highlight some of these impacts. And as you can see, there's a huge positive data, particularly in Africa, where between almost the same period, we've had only around 210 studies that could have been identified that have tried to look into these impacts. But of course, a deeper investigation shows that the studies really didn't go into some species-focused kind of research. They were more or less, a bit of mentioning some of these impacts alongside other ecological impacts like population increase and general development in the landscape. And of course, within the continent, again, we must say that Southern Africa and Eastern Africa seem to have really taken the lead. And I think if you look at the current targeted areas for infrastructural growth, these sections of the continent also appear to be the ones that are leading. Up in the north, we seem to be having very little happening. And so it's which of course coincides with the diversity, or rather the biological diversity that can be seen from that region, but East and Southern Africa seems to be really dominating. And specifically at the regional level, next. If you look at what's in Africa again, South Africa seems to be taking the largest chunk of this work. There's much awareness in terms of what has been done and what is being done to try and address these impacts. And within the East Africa, Tanzania seems to be leading the pack and Kenya lags behind at 16. And yet the current development projects really seem to be targeting Kenya as within the East African region. And therefore, it really calls for some concern and some interest to really start being taken care of. And specifically in Kenya, some of these issues are really linked to the recent infrastructure that we look at in the next slide. But before then, this kind of growth really have escalated in recent past. That next. It is not surprising that, as early as at 1998, already there was concerns that animals being killed on the roads will really surpass issues of hunting and illegal killing of wildlife. And I think we haven't really done a comparison at the moment, but that would be an interesting thing to look into in terms of the numbers, as we'll see in some of my results. The numbers of mammals and birds killed on the road seem to really be pretty high compared to illegal poaching. Next. Next. So while all this is happening, it's also concerning that it's happening at the backdrop of the global decline, global biodiversity decline, as presented by the WWF's Living Planet Index. You could see that regions such as the African continent is really losing close to 65% of its vertebrate population. And of course, areas like South America going as far as high as 94%. And these are quite concerning. And therefore, if we are going to lose biodiversity in terms of roadkills, but also we are losing them as a result of other background, factors or impacts, then I think really there's need to wake up and start considering how we can reduce some of those losses in biodiversity. Next. Now, as I mentioned, Kenya becomes very interesting because at the moment there are lots of projects that the country is initiating that are focused around development corridors, with the first one being the LAPSSET corridor, as well as the SGR corridor. So the yellow one is the LAPSSET corridor, which is the Lamu Port South Sudan Transport Corridor, connecting Kenya to other parts of Eastern Africa, as well as the SGR corridor, the Standard Gauge Railway corridor, the pink one, that is also connecting the Kenyan coast to other parts of the country and will traverse all the way to Cameroon. And the implication is that these areas, or rather these corridors, are traversing key conservation areas, the ones in green, that are also having loss of endemic and threatened wildlife species. And the implications of that is that we are likely to see a lot of decline or a lot of impacts on biodiversity. So for our work in Nairobi, we tried, first of all, to focus on one of those key areas, that is the Tsavo Conservation Area. Next. Continue. So the Tsavo Conservation Area is quite important to us, as it's one of the most important protected areas in the country, with covering close to 42,000 square kilometers, and it's composed of both protected areas, that's the Tsavo East and the Tsavo West National Parks, as well as very important wildlife dispersal areas, which is almost half the same, half the area protected. And it has got a lot of, elephant population, close to 40% of the country's population, close to 18% of Kenya's black rhino population, and over 400 species of bird, as well as other mammal species. But the most important bit is the kind of threats that this landscape is facing, particularly issues of land use change that has been alluded to. But the most amazing is the new proliferation of infrastructure, particularly the Standard Gauge Railway and the associated feeder roads that are connecting both to the parts of Tanzania and parts of the other counties that are surrounding the region. And of course, of late, there's been a lot of agriculture emerging and sedentarization of the pastoralist communities that are aligned that, or rather that surround these landscapes. And at the moment, there's also planned to construct an express highway from Mombasa all the way to Nairobi, and it's also going to traverse the same landscape. And there are chances that it's going to, bisect that entire landscape into two, leading to blockage of movements. Next. So for us at the moment, to highlight some of those impacts, we targeted two roads on the landscape, and that's the A109 and the A23. And the reason we did this is, as I mentioned, we still don't have a lot of data on some of these impacts, and therefore we had to start from somewhere, and of course build on what has been done in other parts of the world. Continue.
You have 1 minute.
Thank you. So some of the key findings, continue. Some of the key findings is that we found a lot of mammals have been killed within half of the year. So this is data from January up to June of 2020, and we had close to 120 different animals killed on this road, representing close to 50 mammal and bird species, as well as reptiles. And this is a huge loss. You can see some of the most important ecosystem, mammals, or other indicators are actually some of the targets. Continue. And in terms of the spatial distribution, we're also very interested in identifying some of the key hotspots. And one of the things we found was that these hotspots are concentrated in areas that are close to urban settlements or close to water resources, but also close to areas where the roads seem to be intersecting. And so there was a huge concern in terms of what really is attracting some of these mammals to these regions. But the most important is when you look at that area around Taveta, where there seems to be a huge, spread. It's actually dissecting that entire southwest section of protected area into two, and that means movement of animals between those two sections is quite impacted. Continue. Next. Continue. So, without going into my details, some of the key conclusions that we could, come up with is that as much as transportation infrastructure through wildlife ranges is increasingly becoming wildlife sinks for many vulnerable and near threatened species, as we've seen with our data, but also that wildlife mortality is not just determined by infrastructure itself, but there are other adjacent landscape features that we are just starting to identify. And in order to try and mitigate some of these impacts, we really need to integrate both technical, social, and ecological solutions, as we've seen that it's not just, the hard infrastructure itself, but people's utilization of that landscape, as well as the characteristics or other ecological characteristics of some of these mammal and bird species. So I think we are looking into that as we go forward. And I think I'll hand over to Karma to try and, give us a bit more from the other continents insofar as the impacts are concerned. Thank you.
Thank you, Tobias. Good evening from Manila, the Philippines. Thank you very much to WWF, IIN, and all the amazing organizations that have put together this webinar series. It is a great honor to have the opportunity to share ADB and my experience in this platform. So my presentation will focus on experiences from working on transport projects in South Asia. Next, please. So the focus of my presentation is around this publication, which ADB had prepared late last year. And I don't want to focus too much on the contents of this publication. I would like to talk more about the journey that we had to undertake and the story that went and the process that went into preparing the report, and share our experiences which are not documented in this report. And we often do not get to even report on it formally, even within our ADB internal documents. To also share some knowledge and tips, which usually is not available in any manual or rule book. These are some kind of tips and tricks that you have to somehow pick up along the way as we go about designing and implementing projects. And also to highlight the real practical challenges that professionals face when we go out into the countries and try to design and implement projects with ecologically challenging situations, especially in the context of limited time, limited resources, limited technical capacity, which is most often the case for most of our projects in South Asia. Next, please. So the journey that I would like to share is about experiences that we have collected over 10 years. And this slide is quite a busy slide, but I will not go into all the little details in the boxes. So basically, I would like to highlight that we have accumulated experiences over 10 projects over a period of roughly 10 years. And this was in the South Asia Transport Division in ADB. That was where I was until very recently. And you see the timeline and the project. So it shows that the project was approved in that year. So if you look at the boxes, you'll see that there are projects in Bhutan, in India, in Nepal, and Bangladesh. And most of these projects are road improvement projects. And I have in red highlight, in red font, the main sort of ecological sensitive features of the project. So I have listed the name of the wildlife species, or if there is a national park. So these are the projects where we've had the most sensitive ecological challenges. Of course, we have many more transport projects in the South Asia Transport Division, but I'm just focusing on the projects with ecological challenges. Next slide, please. So in the beginning of my career with ADB, when I started off back in 2010, I was much younger, naive, and but still very enthusiastic and passionate. And I was all set to go to meet with our government counterparts. And I was equipping myself with all these documents, which were very, very informative. So I have my ADB Safeguard Policy Statement document. I have my IFC Performance 6 standard at hand. I have my IUCN red list handy on my computer, and then the Google Map, IBAT tool. I have a bunch of documents on the local acts and regulations on forestry and wildlife. And I have a host of other information and literature. So I felt that I'm pretty well equipped and I can do this. But for the first couple of years, 3 or 4 years, it was quite challenging. There was something which I realized that we were not getting. So yeah, so the question was, is it enough to be equipped with all these documents? And, is that enough? Do we need to do more? So then, next slide, please. So it was not enough. So I realized the first couple of years that I need to put these documents aside and really listen to the engineer who's sitting across the table. And I have these questions here, these 4 questions, which were asked most frequently throughout these different countries in South Asia. And at the beginning of my career, so my answers are the ones given in blue font. So, of course, one of the questions would be, why do we need to be concerned about wildlife? This is a road project. And initially, when these questions came in, I would always try to look into the answers from these documents and try to explain and say, yeah, but it's an ADB requirement. If you are going to be taking an ADB loan, you need to, comply with the policy. Elephant is an endangered species. It's listed in the IUCN Red List. We have to do, we have to make sure that we don't affect the population of the species or the habitat of the species. But still, the message was not really getting across. Then the next question, and the questions keep getting tougher. So the next question is, what should we do? Okay, if you say it's required, then what should we do to prevent or minimize impacts on wildlife? How can we do it? How much is it going to cost? So these are the things which really matters to the engineer, because we have to remember at the end of the day, in many cases, the engineer, the road engineer or the railway engineer, they have been trained to build the road, to build the rail, cost effectively, good quality. And usually they don't have to worry too much about, animals or forests or trees or wildlife habitat. Usually those are things which are managed by the forestry department or the wildlife department, and they don't really have to worry about it. So that's the perspective of the engineer that's sitting across the table. So at that point, my answer would be yes, we need to carry out ecological studies, build underpasses, overpasses. And of course, I didn't have an answer on the cost. And even today, we are still struggling to get a clear idea of the cost of these structures. The next question, it's really tough. Is it going to work? Okay, you tell us that we need to make underpasses, overpasses in the project, but is it going to work? Is it going to be worth the money? Because we have to remember most of them are taking loan. It's not free money. What evidence do you have it's going to work? That's really tough. Especially at the beginning, we don't have much evidence. And then I just have to say, yes, well, it's worked in the US, it's worked in Europe, it's worked in other parts of the world. And then we had a small study which we had initiated in Bhutan on monitoring 4 underpasses, and the early findings were quite positive. So then, of course, I mentioned these 4 underpasses, but then most experience is still documented in the US and Europe and other countries. So there's not so much experience within Asia and particularly South Asia. So then the other question is there wildlife similar to ours? This is in the context of, examples from the US and Europe. And I have to say, not so much. They don't have elephants and tigers. So really, these are the kind of questions which came to us every time we went out, to implement a project and talk to the engineer across the table. And initially, I kind of did not pay too much attention, but when I 4 or 5 years into this job, then I realized that we need to pay more attention into finding good answers to these questions. Next slide, please.
You have 1 minute left.
Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. Yes. So good answers is training, training, training. So whatever we do, it should be a mix of, I think, more carrots and some sticks, because we have to comply with policies and requirements. So we've organized a lot of trainings and investing in bringing in well-reputed international, regional, and national technical experts that are recognized within the country. This is very, very important. Next slide, please. And I keep these questions on the side because I realize that when we find answers to these questions, then eventually we are able to, convert the engineer on the other side. So build bridges between the Wildlife Forestry Department and the engineer, because typically there is not so much collaboration that goes on between these agencies. Monitor performance of existing structures and draw lessons. This is also very important. Next slide, please. And produce knowledge and guidance. So over the course of implementing these projects, we've collected a lot of information, literature, and knowledge, and we've put it together here. And many thanks to Norris Dodd, who is this fantastic wildlife expert that we have that helps ADB on many of our transport projects. So with his help, we have put together this document. Next slide, please. And this is just to show that some of the contents of the document, it has a whole host of tools and data and, even the pictures on what the different kind of green infrastructure options are. This document is available on the internet. If you just look up this title, you can find it. So this is something which has helped to answer all those 4 questions. Next slide, please. So at the end of the day, this is the main message that I would like to convey is we need to work on converting the engineer into a wildlife champion. And along the way, you have lots of carrots, you give a lot of incentives, help to make their life easier, give them solutions, and it is possible. Next slide, please. So what have we achieved? So this is the results over the course of the 10 years. Of the 10 projects, we have these 5 projects. We have some good things going on. And I would just like to highlight, you see the picture of the 2 underpasses on the right side of the screen. So this is the finding from the Bhutan Road Network Underpass Monitoring Study. So after all the years, the underpass has become like, it becomes like a natural hole and the road is on top. And the picture of the gaur and the elephant, these are wildlife data, which was pictures which were captured by the camera that was installed in the underpass. And we have generated other kinds of knowledge products. We have some good things going on in this Nepal projects where we will have about 55 wildlife underpasses, medium and large underpasses. In the Bangladesh project, this is a railway project, very, very exciting, where we will have an elephant overpass, which is ready for construction. We will have some underpasses, and we will have pilot testing of sensor technology, where we are looking into finding technology that can be integrated into the railway system to alert the train driver to prevent elephant train collisions. And then you see the little picture, I know if you can tell. So these are wildlife champions that we have created along the way through different parts of South Asia. Next slide, please.
Can you wrap up right now, Karma?
Yes, please.
Great.
So this is the last slide. So overall for ADB, our strategy is to develop a biodiversity roadmap. And at the moment, we are at the concept stage and preparing it, and hope to have this approved by management by around 2021 or latest 2022. And we are looking into improving the biodiversity components within existing projects, and also going forward, having a conscious effort in improving biodiversity and having biodiversity positive elements in project design. So with that, I would like to close my presentation and just convey again the key message that we should really work towards converting our engineers into wildlife champions. Then it becomes much easier to comply with any kind of requirement or regulation. Thank you very much. Sorry, so I would like to hand over to Tamara, the next speaker, please.
Thank you, Karma. Let me get to the content of presentation. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. The aim of the project was to build a green bridge to ensure the migration of animals over the D2 highway, genetic exchange, movement for food sources, reduction of barrier effect, and ensuring the reduction of a traffic accident in the evaluated section of the D2 highway. Next slide. Next slide. Thank you. AKK project was a cross-border project with the participation of Austrian and Slovak institutions, governments, spatial planning authorities, organizations responsible for the preparing and construction of infrastructure, like NDS, universities, and non-government organizations. The aim of the project is revitalization of the border region and preservation of the wild animals migration corridor within the Alpine Carpathian corridor. One of the main measures of the AKK project is the improvement of the transport network by building a green bridge on the D2 highway, direction Bratislava-Brno, and two green bridges at the A4 highway, direction Vienna-Budapest, as well as the installation of a warning system along the roads in order to prevent collision with wild animals. Next slide. Thank you. The construction of the Green Bridge has undergone on environmental impact assessment processes based on the report on assessment of impact of the proposed activity of environment. Variant number 2 was selected. The variant was also confirmed by University of Soil Culture in Vienna and by Ministry of Environment of Slovak Republic in a form of final statement in the EIA process. On the slide, you can see the main advantages of variant number 2. The composition of plants got designed in the project of vegetation modification. The composition of plants designed on the dendrological survey, which is based on the assumed habitat condition and the requirements of the proposed 3 species. The original 3 species that are typically for this locality were preferred. The project reflected the compositional and aesthetic condition as well as the safety aspect. Now my colleague will take it over now.
Thank you, Emma. Next slide, please. Okay. After the construction was completed, migration monitoring began on the Green Bridge. The condition of the monitoring proposal follows the final statement of the environmental impact assessment. Monitoring of the occurrence of animals was carried out by a combination of creating of send files, monitoring in open terrain and photo traps. Sandy soil allowed us to create a send file filed under tall trees on both sides of the Green Bridge by digging and cleaning soil from sludge, which was then used to record footprints of animals crossing Green Bridge. Data from photo traps were mainly used for statistical evaluation of migration. Information on of the species, date, time, or direction of movement of animals was made from each series of captured photos. The highest incidence was recorded in medium and large mammals like badger, wild boar, roe deer, red fox, wolf, and lynx. Next slide, please. The result of first year of monitoring are as follows. In 2018, our automatic cameras captured 143 animals records and 42 human records. The largest activity of game and wildlife was captured in the autumn months, especially in October and November. Naturally, it was because of the increased mobility of ungulates to their wintering grounds and migrating for the food resources. The dominant species was roe deer, and biggest group was made by ungulates. This was caused because the Greenwich is in the surrounding hunting areas dominated by roe deer. Large carnivores like lynx or wolf have not been recorded at all. They do not have a regular occurrence in this area and its wide surrounding. Wild game, despite its smaller numbers, use the green bridge for the purpose for which it's intended. That means the transition between two sides of the motorway. Such behavior suggests that wildlife is already fully adapted to the condition of migration through this migratory object. Nevertheless, mitigation measures have been proposed to further increase the functionality of the green bridge. Main mitigation measures are reduce of environmental stress, increase the attractiveness of the environment, and prevent game from moving towards the road. Next slide, please. In 2019, the largest activity of game was captured during the spring months, especially in April, and the dominant species was again roe deer. From the point of the view of carnivores, the situation changed during 2019 because fox and badgers were recorded. The body of the green bridge gradually overgrows and becomes more attractive for smaller pieces. Compared to 2018, the game behaved very cautiously on the body of the green bridge. During the summer and autumn of 2019, when the green bridge began to overgrow with taller grasses and scrubs, the behavior calmed down and the game spent more time on the body of the green bridge itself. A separate part of the monitoring results consists of human activity. What is interesting is that the green bridge is very much used by people. Man is the second most common record species of the green bridge. People use the green bridge to cross the highway in the winter for sledging. And there is also have been a citizen who were stalling our photo traps. We ask everyone not to take an example from these people because disturbance of game and thus is reducing the effectiveness of the green bridge. The migration measures have not changed compared to 2018. Okay, that was, I think, last one. Next one. Thank you. And Whisper, it's your turn.
Esquext, everybody. That is good morning in the Salish language. And I'm going to be talking about a case study on the Native American reservation where I live. Next slide. So I wanted to be able to kind of show us where the landscape is that I'll be talking about. We are in West Central Montana. The red line around the little boot-shaped area is the 1.3 million acres of the Flathead Indian Reservation. That is the retained homelands of the Confederated tribes here that are the result of the 1855 Hellgate Treaty with the federal government. It's a historical document, but it still really drives a lot of the things that we do today. Next slide. And the people that still live on the reservation, not all of our members live on the reservation, but a lot of us do. And I wanted to throw up this picture to kind of show people. A lot of times we use contemporary pictures because people get their thoughts and ideas that Native Americans are these historical people, but we are still here today. And so the majority of my photos that I wanted to show are people that live here right now and do a lot of work for the land right now. The three tribes that occur here are the Bitterroot Salish, the Kalispé, which is sometimes referred to as Ponderay, and Kasenka, which is a Kootenai band of natives that live in our area as well. We manage our natural resources, we manage cultural resources. We recently purchased a hydroelectric dam on the reservation, and we have a large workforce of highly educated people that stem from our tribal college as well as universities in the state of Montana. And so we really are a people of vision. That is what our mission is, and that we look to future generations and protecting the reservation and the reserved homelands that we still have here. And so how this relates to infrastructure and nature is that we have a pretty large natural resource department. We have about 200 employees that manage all types of natural resources here, including wildlife and fisheries. And we have a lot of land and a very variable landscape that we manage. Next slide. And so because of our treaty language that still manages what we do today, because of the fact that we have people in really professional positions, there was a time in the early 90s when the Montana Department of Transportation looked at the road that was running through the heart of the reservation and said, this is a very dangerous road. You have a high level of traffic driving up and down this road. You have very narrow shoulders, and we are situated in between I-90 to the south of us, which is a pretty major east-west transportation corridor, and we have Flathead Lake and Glacier National Park to the north of us. So seasonally, we get a lot of tourist traffic driving through the reservation, and there's a lot of rural housing developments. So it was really showing itself to be a very dangerous highway to drive. There were a lot of head-on collisions. It was a problem. And so the Department of Transportation, as the agency that is in charge of protecting the traveling public and making commerce be able to move smoothly, came to the tribes who have tribal sovereignty and governance over the lands within the reservation, and they said, we want to expand this highway. It's dangerous. We need to do something. And we're proposing a divided 4-lane highway through the entire reservation. In our experience, a divided 4-lane highway is essentially an interstate. And so the tribes were resistant to that idea and said, we have different values for our land, and we don't want to just have a potentially 80-mile-an-hour, 100-mile-an-hour highway flying through the heart of our landscape. So because tribes and states have different political designations, tribes are not under the state of Montana. Tribes are supposed to be dealt with as a parallel to the state of Montana. So we're both under the federal government, but the tribes are not under the state. We are to be treated as equals and negotiated as such. So when the tribe said, we're not too keen on a 4-lane highway, and we'd like to consider some other things when we look at this highway system, then the state of Montana had to take a step back and look at that and think about how do we try to incorporate what the tribes are saying into building highways in a way that we're not used to doing, and paying for things that we're not used to paying for. Because as was said earlier, engineers try to build roads in an efficient and inexpensive and safe way. And here the tribes and our natural resources and our cultural resources were saying, okay, we understand that and we want people to be safe too, but there's other things to consider here. And when we think about our culture on the reservation, we had to say the wildlife was the decision. The wildlife would be the proxy for the culture, because that is the movement across the land. They're the ones that move across the land. And so the highway should be respectful of the land and our spirit of place. The state and the tribes weren't able to come to agreements at that point. And so the Federal Highway Administration, as the agency that really grants the funding and as having special trust responsibility to tribes as a federal agency, had to come in and help to negotiate that situation. And we started to have those negotiations in about 1999. Next slide. And some of the ideas that really bubbled up was that the tribes care about the land, that our culture has to be considered and respected, and that there are a lot of different ways that we could do that. And they were really following kind of the concepts of landscape ecology and connecting landscapes and just the movement of energy across the landscape. Next slide. And so once the negotiations got through, I mean, this is years of people sitting in rooms and learning how to get along. They finally came together with this holistic approach and trying to come up to do the goals of developing an understanding of the relationship that the tribal people have with our land here, finding ways that the road could shape that the landscape could shape the road. The picture at the top shows a completely filled in road that goes right through a big pothole that was created by glacial activity a long time ago. And so if you can kind of see, I know my picture's small, at the one side of it, the old road used to go around the pothole. But in the 50s, when the highway was put in that is here, they just filled it all in and just took it right through the pond. There's no underwater connection. There's no way for wildlife to get across. So that is some of the things that we started to think about. Restoring habitats, not just going right through wetlands to restore those wetlands and restore the water. To also think about the small towns that the highway's traveling through, to really think back and pull back and say, we don't need to be driving 70 miles an hour through these people's town. We need to slow it up. We need to think about some more beautification and using signs with language, with the Salish and Kootenai language on it, to show people that they're entering an Indian reservation when we hit there. Some of that, most of it was funded through the Department of Transportation. The tribes have come up with funding along the way. Next slide.
You have 1 minute left, please.
Next slide. And so we have these different wildlife crossing structures that have been built to date. And we have various sizes to accommodate different sized wildlife species. And the map on the side showing the reservation again, all those colored blocks are protected lands for wildlife habitat or cultural areas. They have been designated by the tribes and set aside from development and for protection. Next slide. And these crossing structures are a conglomerate of uses. Next slide. So there's fencing, there's jump outs, there's the crossing structures. This one doesn't have water flowing through it right now, but they do, and that attracts wildlife. Next slide. And these are just some pictures of the animals that are using these structures. Next slide. Anytime we have deer, elk, moose that are not crossing over the highway, either getting killed and are still available as food for wildlife, for people, or they are not causing a collision, that's a huge win. Next slide. We have cats using our structures. Next slide. And bears do use the crossing structures on the reservation. We're still looking at some modifications for grizzlies to use them more frequently with cubs, but they're still using them at this time. Next slide. And small mammals as well. Next slide. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Whisper. That was so inspiring to actually see how these things work. And one of our favorite tools in this line of work is that camera trap. And unfortunately, as one of you mentioned, other people like free cameras too. So people do tend to lose them once in a while. This has been really an eye-opening experience, and we are running a bit late. I'm going to offer the audience 5 extra minutes so that we can get as many questions as we can. We got some really great questions coming, and then we'll close 5 minutes late, but you're of course welcome to take off. And note that we will have this published as a video so you can come back and see what you missed later on. So for the first question, I want to start with Wendy. Are you ready, Wendy? Here's a cool question about the times we're in. With COVID recovery, what political steps are needed to have the ecological connectivity be considered in these new investments? And do you see a role for the UN Environment Assembly number 5 to play a role in this regard?
Yeah, this is such an important question, and we're really at this crux moment, I think, with how economic development will proceed. You know, do we bounce forward post-COVID to a more nature-positive world, or do we do the opposite? And we're seeing examples of both those things in different countries, of course. So I think absolutely, UNEA has a role to play. I think, you know, UNEA is a more an environment ministry type body, so we need to get that agreed there. But then we really need to take that message to the financial sectors and to the governments where this construction will happen, and also to look at, let's not look at recovery as great infrastructure only, but you know, how can we target and channel some of that funding into nature-based solutions and different types of investments that are really going to help build back economies, but also create the ecological connectivity and nature resilience that we need.
Yeah, you know, infrastructure lasts forever. You know, there used to be a commercial in the United States, diamonds are forever. When you're buying a ring, it supposedly cements your marriage forever. But that's the interesting thing about infrastructure. It lasts and lasts well beyond the builders. So we need to get it right for our future. And that's why these big conventions, and we also, I should say, the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, is setting up new targets for the world for the next 10 years. This is the time to make sure these elements get in. And then we have, of course, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change doing a lot of new decision making. And this new super year of 2021 was going to be 2020, now 2021. So policy movement is out there and everybody needs to get involved. The second question let's go to a really specific question, which is interesting to Karma. Are crossings combined with wildlife fencing along the Sasek Road near Chitwan? How specific can you get? Yes. But you can expand a little.
Very specific question. So that's a good question. And we are considering fencing. Usually we do need it to work together with the underpasses in order to funnel the wildlife to use it properly. And this is something which we are still studying. We would have finished studying it, but again, because of COVID, so a lot of the survey work had to be kept on hold. So at the moment, we have been able to finalize the locations and the design of the underpass structures, but we will likely have fencing near some of those structures. So.
And you recognize that fencing is a key part of how this works. Could you just say a little more about why fencing? And we just saw a picture of it from Whisper, but just a little more about what's so important about fencing.
So when you build an overpass or an underpass, and there is still a risk that the wildlife will not use it and still go up the road. And it's kind of like a training for the wildlife. So it's usually put on either side of the underpass or the overpass, so that the wildlife, when they're trying to cross the road, if there is a fence blocking, then they cannot, you know, cross. So then they will be somehow funneled back to use the underpass. So it's essential. However, we have to be careful, because sometimes if the fence is not throughout the road, it could be that some wildlife, you know, at the edge of the fence, they may start crossing, and that becomes a very fatal point where there could be a lot of accidents. So we have to be very careful in placing, you know, in deciding on the location and the length and the type of the fence. And it has to work together with the kind of wildlife species that are there in that particular area.
One of the most popular sessions I went to in one of these IENE road ecology conferences was on that exact point. We had hundreds of people spilling into the hall to learn about how animals find that end of the fence and they go around, and what do we do about it, because it undermines the whole point. So really fascinating, never-ending science on that. And one more specific question and then a broad question. Tamara Malan, we're wondering, and so was I, about this carnivore issue. Are the carnivores going to come back? Do they prefer to go under the road? Are they just, you said they're just not around. Is that forever, or is that something you hope will change?
I think that it's because it's not a very common area for them. It's always part of Slovakia, so there is big population of ungulates, as I said, and maybe that's the reason why there is not a big migration about the carnivores. But we don't have a data about the missing animals. We have data about what we saw on the cameras. So it's just
But with
my
all those ungulates, someday you're going to get somebody coming back, you hope, right? There's plenty of prey.
And there was another question, I think.
No, I think I'm going to ask that of the last two speakers and get you off the hook because it's a tough one. It's about the cost modeling. And would it be possible, maybe Wendy, sorry, not Wendy, Andreas and Rob could attack this one. Are there existing resources for undertaking cost benefit analyses, especially for enterprises? And then in a similar vein, can you expand on the referred links that you made, Rob, to biodiversity and financial institutions? Both of you have been working with governments a lot. You understand the challenges of budgets. And you also, and I've talked to you about it, the issue of how do you cost these things in a way that won't just have people ignore them. So could you both explore that a little as our way to close this out, because it's one of the thornier issues we face.
Yes.
Go ahead, Andres.
Okay. The cost-benefit analysis of these mitigation measures is always a very, very tricky one, and it's probably not a very useful approach either, because we always end up short on the wildlife side. We cannot really estimate the costs that we are producing by building a road and not making these mitigation measures. But we can easily calculate the costs for the different measures that we have to invest in putting them in place. So there will always be a cost, but on the benefit side for wildlife or nature, we will always be short. What is of course possible that you compare different measures with each other in a cost effectiveness analysis. But that always then requires some kind of a political or a policy statement where you say that we need to make sure that we provide a specific function, connectivity, for example, through this area. And then we have to find the most effective, cost-effective solutions. But from a benefit point of view, it's really tricky.
Monetizing the benefits is what we need to be working on, everyone.
Right.
Making them, not necessarily the monetary benefits, but making everybody value the benefits enough to care.
Yes.
Rob, we get basically closing remarks.
Yes, just on cost benefits, we have done several studies, both in North America. When you have large mammals causing the collisions on roads, it's easier to look at the costs to the motorists and their vehicles, et cetera. And so that's the very beginning of a cost benefit, and it has been done. And one of the points we've made in North America is that to do nothing costs money too. Continued crashes, continued loss due to animal mortality. So often we say it's always the cost of doing something that is when we engage in the cost benefit. So to do nothing also is costing society things that are of value beyond economics, the conservation value of the animals, right?
And Tobias, yeah, I mean, Tobias, I'd lived in Africa for a long time, and every time a nice new paved roads goes in, the cars go faster and the deaths happen. And sometimes it's due to this wildlife. And as you were describing, we have more and more data about this in Africa. Are you finding it's convincing people that we need to pay more attention and invest more in mitigation measures?
Thank you, Kate. At the moment, we haven't really been able to, get through to most of the public members in terms of how they're supposed to behave and drive on the roads that are passing through protected areas. But I think in the recent past, particularly during the COVID era, we were able to show the variations in terms of roadkills, and a number of people came on board through social media, where they started posting some of the pictures, and a lot of people are now getting more and more aware that something needs to be done. So in response to that, we've actually formed what we are calling the Kenya Roadkills Working Group, which is actually an open, more or less a citizen science approach to the issue of raising awareness. And one of the things we're looking at is also to try and bring this matter to the attention of the government, particularly those involved with the traffic regulation, so that it can be treated like any other regular traffic offense. But I think in terms of the public appreciation of such impacts, we are still lagging behind. And that is because we've never had quantifiable data, and some of the pictures now we are showing to really raise that awareness and let people understand the implications of their actions on the roads.
Exactly. And if people start making the demands from every corner and the data is there and available, policymakers find it easier to actually make new decisions and do a better job of mitigating this incredible challenge. This is the wave of the future. We have to figure out how to live in harmony with wildlife and let nature move. Permeability of roads is the same as the permeability of those tigers that Wendy was talking about, able to get out there and find a mate and find something to eat. And we are finding that the science is out there, and the bridges are starting to be built across to the engineering and the finance community. It is actually tremendous progress from what I understand in these past 10 years or so, maybe 20. And this community is getting out there and telling folks. So it's really exciting. It's really fun. And as I said before, if you ever have a chance to go to a road ecology conference in your continent, the one coming up that Andreas was mentioning in Portugal, now that they're virtual, we can all go, and it's fascinating stuff, absolutely fascinating stuff. I totally recommend it. I'm a convert. And now I'd like to say goodbye and pass it to our friend Ryan, who's going to tell us about the next event. Thank you all for coming. Ryan.
Thanks so much, Kate. If we can pull up the slide there. Yes, so another fantastic discussion. Thank you to everyone, the nearly 300 of you that we had at our peak for this great session. So we have one final session in this first series where we're really going to talk about exactly those questions around policy discussions that are coming up in the super year next year for the IUCN and the World Conservation Congress that looks likely to be held sometime in the fall. The UNFCCC, Paris Accord, all of these various global events are now talking about the intersection of these key issues. So we have one final session. It'd be great if you could register. You can go to iene.info, where you'll find the link to the webinar series where you can watch videos of the previous series, and this one will be posted as well, and register for this event, which will be on Thursday, December 10th. So thank you so much for your attendance. Have a great Thanksgiving if you celebrate that holiday in the US, and otherwise we look forward to seeing you on the next one. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.